In this video, the naval historian Marcus Faulkner will give an overview of the naval side of the war in Ukraine from February up to mid-June 2022. We cover the initial balance of forces, the tactical, operational and political importance of Snake Island, how the Russian Navy supported the land warfare. Of course, we also cover the loss of the cruiser Moskva and how the delivery of Harpoon anti-ship missiles might affect the war, among various more topics.
So what has happened so far, or what has happened in the first 2 to 3 months, moving to that second question you've set me? Well, it's fairly clear, and it shouldn't really come as a surprise, that there is a considerable dominance of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. That separation of the spoils of the Cold War back in the 1990s into the Russian Black Sea Fleet and the Ukrainian Navy already left the Ukrainian Navy as a significantly weaker partner in that arrangement. In the subsequent years, it suffers from underfunding, and by the events of 2014 also led to the loss of a lot of its base infrastructure, Sevastopol being the key base in all of this. A lot of material was lost and some personnel was lost also too. So the Ukrainian Navy, or fleet, if you will, that we have left in 2022 is a very small force. We're talking about one frigate, which scuttled fairly early on in the war at Mykolaiv, a collection of a corvette, all the missile boats, some gunboats, mostly auxiliaries and patrol craft. Nothing comparable to what the Russians have. In addition, there is a sizable naval infantry component, some helicopters, some UAVs, which will then play a role later on. But this is a coastal navy, what we might term a littoral navy these days. Set against this, the Black Sea Fleet's order of battle is considerable. The cruiser Moskva, its flagship, 5 frigates, a half dozen submarines in various conditions, corvettes, auxiliary craft, minesweepers, a concentration of the northern Baltic and Black Sea fleets, amphibious shipping and landing craft, some naval aviation in all of this too. So the force disparity is considerable. And the result is very quickly, the Russians did attain dominance of the sea. So Russia establishes what we might term command of the sea. Well, I'll qualify that in a moment, and imposes a military blockade on the Ukrainians within days of this. And in the first instance, this was easy to achieve given the inability of the Navy to contest the Russian efforts. And one of the first actions involved is the Russian force led by the cruiser Moskva attacking Snake Island, immortalizing the very small Ukrainian border guard garrison. It is the iconic moment, that label of Russian cruiser, go fuck yourself. It's historic. We should use that, is a defining moment and is very important in that initial Ukrainian reaction to that Russian onslaught. And we know, as most people will be familiar with, that it feeds into the Ukrainian narrative of resistance, and it makes it onto a postage stamp of that iconic picture that is going to define the war for so long. The president presents the stamp, and that first moment in the conflict, probably one of the defining moments of the first days of the conflict, takes place at sea on this small island, which nobody has heard about, and now it plays a very central role in all of this. So it's a key moment in creating the narrative of the war. The importance of Snake Island is, I use the term that is more familiar with rather than the proper name, because that also connotates something completely different in the minds of the international audiences. So it controls or overlooks rather, the northern exit of the Danube, and also to a degree would also control the flow of north-south traffic through the Black Sea, or at least the western part of the Mediterranean. So from that island, you can exert a degree of control, at least influence. And the Battle of Snake Island, as I'm terming it now, the summer campaign, if you will, that we are currently seeing, is really only gains momentum after the loss of the Moskva, which is providing it with cover in the middle of April. But it's really now then in the last few weeks at the time of recording, so middle of June-ish, where this is taking on a greater stage. And I suspect we'll see over the coming months more of this. It is a crucial point within that maritime system of the Eastern Black Sea. So having established command of the sea, or more accurately, I think it would be to say a significant degree of sea control, as we would term it. What happens next? Well, these are a classic. Yeah.
How would one exert control or influence from Snake Island with land-based anti-ship missiles? Because I don't think you can harbor ships there or refuel them or something, or the bigger facilities there.
There is a small jetty on the island, and in fact, in the last week or two, the Russians have increased their air defenses on the island significantly. So yes, you could install weaponry if you so chose. It wouldn't be necessary if you've actually got the ships out at sea doing the job, but as a point from which you could base rotary aviation to conduct operations, as a base from which you've got a secure starting point, if you wanted to impose greater restriction on shipping moving in and out of Ukrainian waters. Now, as far as we understand it, over the last weeks, there isn't much shipping. There is a cluster of shipping just to the southwest of Snake Island in Romanian and international waters, but there's nothing actually moving into Ukrainian waters. But if you wanted to escalate the conflict from a Russian perspective, you could certainly use this base more proactively. Now, what we've also got to see is the other way around. If the Russians don't hold the island, it would in fact give the Ukrainians a lot of leverage from the political right down to the tactical and operational. At that point, it becomes potentially more viable to move shipping. I wouldn't go so far at this stage, but it's as symbolic as well as operational value. I would put it like that. And I can't see, with the way that the Russians are conducting their campaign in the Ukraine, that they would voluntarily leave the island. It's not a case of withdrawing from the northwestern part of Kiev for a redistribution of forces to the Donbass area. This is a key island outpost, but it's going to become increasingly difficult to hold. So, having pushed back the last bits of the Ukrainian Navy or neutralized them, what is happening at sea? Well, it's the classic naval role of projecting power ashore. And in the first instance, this was conducted through bombardments. The frigates of the Black Sea Fleet and the submarines are equipped to fire caliber cruise missiles. And while some were used in the opening stages of the war, it really only seemed that cruise missile bombardment only seems to have picked up in intensity in the first week of April, or at least that's the evidence we have through the Russians starting to record more and more and putting videos online of caliber launches. That picks up round about the first week of April. And it continues through to this day, although there are lulls in that part of the bombardment as presumably more missiles are being brought up from other parts of Russia for this. I mean, the amount of ordnance being expended is considerable, which also has cost implications. The beginning of April is also when the Russian Navy started to employ its land-based anti-ship missiles, its Bastion systems in land-based anti-ship missiles, that's right, in land attack roles against targets in southern western parts of the Ukraine. Why that happens isn't entirely clear, but it certainly does happen, and it happens to a far greater degree and increases that standoff precision bombardment. It coincides with the shift of emphasis from the northwestern parts of Kiev, that redistribution of forces to the Donbass, the complete reorientation of Russian strategy. So whether or not this is designed to use all precision ordnance in an attempt to destroy Ukrainian internal communications infrastructure, in that race to redistribute forces, we're not clear. All Russia was running out of air-launched precision ordnance. The reasons are probably a combination of those factors, but again, it is noticeable that tempo of operations picks up, and from the beginning of April, there's a lot of naval equipment or naval standoff weapons are being employed. Now, at the western end of the theater, in the Gulf of Odessa, in the first few weeks of the conflict, jumping a little bit back and forth in the timeline, what we see is the main body of the surface fleet operating there, increasingly coming closer to the shoreline, operating off the horizon to exert pressure potentially on the Ukrainian forces in and around the Odessa area. There are also conventional artillery bombardments. The Moskva conducts a number of these against positions. Whether or not these are precision attacks, or what we'll term terror attacks, as you'd see on land, is open, presumably more in the latter case. But what we have is the Russian surface fleet effectively operating in a triangular area between Sevastopol, Snake Island in the west, and the top end of the Gulf of Odessa, or just over the horizon of Odessa. That's where it's spending its weeks there. And the early weeks of March into April, that's the surface fleet, so Moskva and its attendant frigates and some of the smaller vessels, and the amphibious forces would make periodic deployments out there, which begs the question of what is the role of the amphibious threat to all of this? Is it there? Well, the potential threat had been built up in the months preceding the war, but I think we have to be somewhat careful about this. A contested amphibious assault is one of the hardest military operations, one of the hardest maritime operations to undertake. And even with the reinforcements from the Baltic and from the Northern Fleet, the lift capacity that the Russians have in the Black Sea, that northwestern end, is fairly limited for the scale of the task available. So is this being configured for a raid in the event that the very short, sharp war against the Ukraine unfolds? Is it the bluff to tie down the Ukrainian forces for them being moved into other areas? We don't know. That's very open. There doesn't seem to be, from all the open source analysis we've had over those weeks, there doesn't seem to be a systematic effort to prepare for an assault. For example, there doesn't seem to be a coordinated use of naval aviation or other parts of aviation to prepare potential areas for attacks. Maybe it's slightly beyond the range. Maybe it also has to do with the fact that the Ukrainian air defenses weren't taken out. It also has to do with the fact that the land operations coming up from the Crimea into Kherson, up into Mykolaiv, stall fairly early on after a couple of weeks. And if you aren't going to break through at Mykolaiv, you're not going to undertake any landings at Odessa. The degree to which this is an amphibious threat in being, if you will, is very much open. The Ukraine also very early on sows defensive minefields. We have to be a bit careful here because the mines are talked about a lot through till today in reference to the clearing of passages for the grain transport. But this is a very speculative area. We've had a couple of mines being blown up or washed up in other areas, but we simply don't know how many were sown, and probably the figure is a lot lower than people think. We have very few estimates, but perhaps somewhere in the region of 400 to 600 mines in total might be in the northwestern part of the Black Sea. Most of them probably will be Ukrainian-sowed mines acting as fixed defenses to the port areas. But these minefields will, again, as the weeks of the summer progress, become an increasingly a political subject in reference to actually opening up, potentially opening up corridors to bring out grain from Ukrainian ports. Now that's what's going on in the west. In the east, in the Sea of Azov, things are a little bit different. There is more direct support to the land forces as they're breaking out, or better, breaking up from the Crimea to create that land bridge to the Donbass. And here it's relatively easy for the Russians to secure control of the sea fairly early on, as the Ukrainians don't have any sizable naval forces there, and because of what's going on the land side. And it's here that the Russian amphibious shipping comes into more use to move up land forces, move up naval infantry, and supplies to relieve the congested land routes as the land front line is moving progressively up to Mariupol, preparing for that siege then eventually. And it's also important to know or to bear in mind that Russian amphibious forces are not necessarily designed to undertake contested landings. It's more about raids, securing in the aftermath, rapid redeployment, not a full-on amphibious assault. And that's exactly how they're operating in the Sea of Azov.
So what is the difference in the setup? So they have less fire support vessels, or how would this look differently to one that is configured for
types of amphibious vessels that they're employing, but the matter in that may predominantly the way in which the troops are being trained and the use that they're going to be put to. The support that the fleet can furnish to any amphibious operations is quite limited. I mean, we're talking about, in terms of direct gunfire support, as you bring that up, is not considerable. There's no more specialized weaponry there, and also the liftability of the Russian amphibious flotilla, if you will, is not necessarily comparable with some of the larger Western ships that we have in Western navies. This is a coastal littoral operating amphibious force, not
so basically on tactical, not operational like US Marines.
No, I wouldn't put it like that. But the US Marines can operate in certainly at different size levels as to how their expeditionary forces are operating. The Russians don't have that much. They do seem to have brought all their naval infantry. Usually, every fleet will have its attached naval infantry and coastal defense artillery and other forces attached. Most of that seems to have been sucked into or deployed and then became sucked into the conflict fairly on. But the Russian Navy just doesn't operate, and its amphibious forces don't operate for large-scale landings that you would need if you wanted to take a city of 1 million people. That's the distinction. So small but coastal hugging and outflanking operations, which is the predominant feature also of maritime warfare in the Black Sea in the Second World War. Also, it's not major fleet actions, but the smaller raiding, outflanking operations. And it's here in the Sea of Azov that we see the Russians take their first significant naval loss. A Alligator class landing ship explodes in Berdyansk harbor on 24th of March. And the Ukrainians are very astute and claim that it's one of their missiles that has sunk it. It might have been an accident. It might have been poor ammunition handling, or the like on the part of the Russians. Again, this is something that we're not certain about, despite a good amount of very decent open source analysis. We'll only find out in due course. But it's, again, a sizable success for the Ukrainians to claim at sea, contrasting with not necessarily a success on the Russian side. We have to be a little bit careful about Ukrainian claims in the maritime environment, as numerous Russian ships have been claimed as sunk, only to turn up later on or turn up slightly damaged. The most recent high-profile case, I believe, is the frigate Admiral Makarov, which was claimed to have been sunk, but I think has been cited since there. So a bit like the war on land, this happens, and we have to put that in.
Yeah, and we, like in World War II, it reminds me of the Battle of Vella La Vella, when both sides claimed that they, I think, sunk basically more than each side had deployed.
I mean, there's an interesting perspective also for the future. Is on land, it's reasonably, certainly was reasonably easier to verify claims, but at sea, what's out of sight is much harder to actually claim. And I think this is also one lesson to take forward into future conflicts, is the actual ability to understand what's going on in the maritime environment is quite different to that on land. The very intense fighting that would develop around the siege of Mariupol, though, seems to suck in a lot of naval infantry that would otherwise have potentially been able to undertake raids or landing operations at the western end, not only Odessa, but also perhaps in relation to operations at Mykolaiv, which then now since have been pushed back. The point is the Russian naval infantry is just being subsumed by the demands of the land battle. So the threat to Odessa at this stage has declined, even though I mean, there's always going to be a latent threat. But I think realistically, Russia has neither the resources nor the intent, seemingly, to undertake anything there. Now, all of this is going on in parallel to the trade or the economic blockade, which from the outset affects a significant amount of international shipping, which is caught up in the conflict at Ukrainian ports, either Western ports or in the Sea of Azov, more so in the latter case. A small number of ships are sunk over the subsequent weeks there in what is effectively the war zone. But the longer term problems of what this blockade, this Russian blockade, would cause were flagged up by those in the know, in the naval or maritime communities, but it's not something that really reaches the public debate or the political levels, political consciousness, until a month and a half after the war started, when it's also clear and the realization sets in that this is a much longer conflict. And at that point, that narrative starts kicking to where we are today, where it's a significant and ongoing factor. 14th of April, Moskva is lost. The implications of that are significant. The Russian fleet pulls back from operating quite so close to shore at the western end of the theater. And the pattern of behavior in the Gulf of Odessa really noticeably changes after that. The surface fleet pulls back much further back, and cruise missile strikes increase. And submarines also seem to be drawn into the process more than they were before, or at the very least, the evidence that submarines are firing cruise missiles or caliber cruise missiles does go up, indicating that that's where you see an uptick in those operations. And it makes sense that the Russians have lost significant air defense capability in the Moskva, and it limits the ability of the forces to operate in the way they were doing before. And this opens up rather what I've termed this battle for Snake Island through into May, through to where we are now. And we see the Ukrainians have a number of successes using a combination of drones and more recently missiles. And on May 7th, two Raptor patrol boats, fast patrol boats, are sunk. And last week, the case of the support vessel of the tug being sunk, as we understand it now, by Harpoon missiles, most likely too. So that's an ongoing focal point and will be, as I said, over the coming summer. Now, a final observational point is that what frames the entire maritime conflict is what people might be familiar with is the situation with regards to Turkey and the closing of the straits and the control of shipping, of military shipping, naval shipping coming up from the Mediterranean. A couple of days into the conflict, on the 28th, Turkey makes the decision to close the straits, and it does so under the Montreux Convention, which is a fairly backwater conventional political settlement from the 1930s as part of that the period of international treaties. The convention from 1936 essentially gives Turkey control over what or who comes in and out of the Black Sea. There are a number of caveats and parameters to this, but essentially it gives Turkey the right to close traffic. It limits the ability of non-Black Sea harbored warships to spend time in the sea. And it limits the size of military shipping in terms both of the physical size of the ships and the duration the time they can spend in the Black Sea. Size in terms of tonnage, it bars over a certain threshold, which effectively rules out aircraft carriers, although aircraft carriers are not specifically mentioned. It's targeted at that. And the total tonnage, if you will, of any external naval force being able to operate in the Black Sea is capped also, so it limits what can be deployed into the Black Sea. Now, the implications of this are considerable. It also limits a stay of externally harbored, based warships to a maximum of 3 weeks. So, considerable implications for the Russian Navy. It means it can't reinforce its warship presence in the Black Sea from the sizable squadron that's operating in the Eastern Mediterranean, which in effect means it can't make good its losses or bring up any more naval units into the Black Sea. That is perhaps the reason why the Russians also are a bit more prudent in how they're employing their forces, because they simply will not be able to be made good. From an outside party or Western perspective, it also means that no major task forces could enter the Black Sea, or in practical terms could be based there owing to this 3-week limit, unless there is direct Turkish support of this. And this opens up a complicated political and operational dynamic in terms of what Turkey might or might not allow in terms of external presence, what ships one could send in. There was, during the siege of Mariupol, French president wanted to send it, or purported to want to send in a major task force to relieve the siege or to extract civilians and the like. We're talking about sizes of task forces involved, which simply wouldn't be permitted under the Montreux Convention, or at least Turkey would have a significant amount of say in that. And that's something to bear in mind in the whole discussion around bringing relief to the economic blockade and allowing the flow of grains and other foodstuffs out of the Ukraine is the ability to actually send warships into the Black Sea to escort is quite limited unless there is a strong support on the Turkish side to sustain them and to allow that. So that's the Montreux Convention is, and the ability that Turkey has to exert pressure on this is a significant factor in shaping the conduct of the maritime war and also the possibilities to open up the trade and the like. I think that's another issue that is important to bear in mind.
One question about the Harpoon missiles, if they were sent, do they change very much the dynamic there, or are they similar to what the Ukrainians, I think they use the Neptune missiles and capabilities?
I am not familiar as to the actual differences between Harpoon and Neptune, what it will mean in practice. But it's important, yes, because it gives the Ukrainians more. The Neptune missiles were only relatively new, and there was some debate as to whether or not the Ukraine actually could field them or had enough to field them, which is why Moskva being taken by surprise in April was a factor in all of this. It's highly likely the Russians did not think that the Ukrainians had such a standoff capability and had Neptune put into service. But even if production might have continued or been completed during the early course of the war, there's simply not a critical mass for Neptune alone to be a deciding factor. I mean, we don't know how many there are, but we're not talking about large numbers here. So the infusion of an additional system, which had always been on the Ukrainian priority wish list for weapons, certainly adds to the ability of the Ukrainians to protect the Odessa area, to deter any amphibious operations. But I think, as we saw last Friday with the attack on Snake Island, it gives the Ukraine the ability to reach out and actually start to interdict the maritime communications with Snake Island more so than they did before. Because there's a difference between if you've got harpoons at your disposal or UAVs carrying relatively limited amounts of ordnance. So yes, it does make a difference. And more so, in fact, than what was originally proposed by the British, which was brimstone missiles, which are now increasing, as far as we can see, been drawn into the land battle, which would have had more of a defensive role around the Odessa area. Harpoon gives that longer range punch, and it makes absolute sense to employ it around Snake Island. And presumably we'll see the Russians approach the island differently or approach their deployment somewhat differently in the current weeks. So that's an overview of the past couple of months and what to look out for in the coming weeks. Again, Snake Island being a focal point, the measures around whether or not there'll be an international agreement to open up ports for the export of Ukrainian grain. I think that's an intractable problem. It's not an issue for which there's very easy solutions, both operationally and politically, as the Russians have the position that the Russians are taking is the polar opposite as what the Ukrainians are willing to do. And again, it rotates around the demining of Ukrainian ports. We will see where that goes, but that's going to be a focal point over the coming weeks because of the implications of, as the war draws out and month after month passes, that economic side and the inability to export the Ukrainian part of foodstuffs will have implications, not only for this year, but also for coming years, for a whole host of reasons. I think for this year, we're already getting quite late into the season, whether or not major exports will still be able to happen. As I say, a lot of the things around here are speculative, and we won't have concrete answers till later on. So we have to be quite careful in some of the assessments.
The YouTube comment section will judge you accordingly.
I'm sure they will, and that's happily so. But that's where we are. So that's something of a very concise overview of the issues and what's been happening over the past weeks. I think it's important also to emphasize that this maritime side is just the tempo of operations. What's happening is very different to the land war. And we've got these peaks or surges of activity followed by long periods of not much happening. I mean, the intensity of naval conflict once you actually get to the engagements is considerable and hard to compare to on land. If we look at the events actually that leads to Moskva's loss, a lot happens in a very short period of time. And while we can't be sure exactly of the sequence of events and what causes it, within moments in comparison to the land fighting, having the flagship of the fleet with a significant crew go through a process where it certainly was heavily damaged, not destroyed initially, and then probably through fires or other damages burns out, but in a very short period of time, a lot of destruction and a lot of casualties are taken. And this contrasts quite considerably to that on land.
I think that it's I remember basically that these are random numbers, but basically war is like 89% is just boring, but 2% are really intense and deadly. And it seems with naval warfare, this is basically times 1,000.
Well, yeah. I mean, we get into some wonky maths there, but
I mean, yeah,
the spirit,
just,
absolutely, that gets it exactly right. I mean, the majority of naval operations are routine patrolling preparations, and we go through most conflicts like this. And then when you get to the moment where there's action, it doesn't matter if it's Second World War, the final point of a submarine hunt or major fleet operations, or today, that's very intense. I think that the difference between where we are now and past is that the reaction times today are even lower to what we had in the past because of the dominance of the missile as a anti-ship weapon and the complexity of defending against certain attacks like that. But when the point comes, naval action is incredibly intense and incredibly destructive also. And there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to withdraw to, or if heavy damage is sustained. And that's part of that dynamic too.
Thank you very much for your time and especially the major input.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.